So here is the book, Bookscape, which, as you kindly said, Loretta, was published after my Peninsula lectures in 2010. And I thought that I would try and say a little bit about how the book was put together and how we might think about the evidence that's available to us, and what we might actually mean by this word that I sort of invented, Bookscape, which is a little bit difficult to translate. I mean, paisate de libros is I think the closest we're going to get to it. And I was thinking particularly in terms of landscape, first of all, of course, which is the most familiar term, and also thinking, though, that landscape is also often represented. So we have an image of landscape or an image of a scape, as well as the practical reality or physical reality of it. And of course, such a landscape also has buildings included, buildings which are part of that sort of image, and people as well. This probably from the mid-18th century is one of the most famous landscapes with people, Mr. and Mrs. Andrews by Gainsborough, not very far from where I grew up in Suffolk in East Anglia. But it makes the point. And of course, more recently, we've come to talk also about townscape in English. I don't know how well that translates, into paisate urbano, but it has an idea of townscape. And so I decided that I wanted to adopt the idea of bookscape in order to capture ideas, particularly which come from cultural history, of place and space. That's to say, the physical site in terms of place, and in terms of space, the practices and the human activities which took place within that site, and particularly in relation to the production, circulation, and reception of the book, however we can very generally conceive of the book, and also thinking about memory, which comes into the aspect of representation that I was just talking about, and how therefore we can put together the idea of space with place, and also represent that and reconstruct it over time, particularly in relation to change and continuity. Now, I just put this in because in English, actually, the word bookscape is a much more interesting way of putting it together, because you can see that place and space and scape work rather well. And so there's a way in which is sort of untranslatable in a way in which we can relate these different ideas quite well together. So we've got place and space and bookscape, but also place and pace, which in terms of an idea of time also works quite well. And hence this was my idea, my conceit in a way, of thinking about Bookscape. So I put it together, as I said, 10 years ago for the Peninsula lectures, which were then on screen and had a lot of movement in them. Things have moved on, as I will show. I hope to show how we can use digital help to present this as well. Presentationally, it was important, but then it was published in 2014. So what I hope today to do for you particularly is to show you the different sorts of historical sources, the different sorts of evidence that one could use to recreate this bookscape. So we start, obviously, with physical views, which are themselves interesting. Everyone has always commented how these early modern views are always seen from above, when of course they couldn't be seen in this way. So there's a great deal of contemporary imagination in this respect. This shows London, of course, with the River Thames, and the only bridge up until 755, the only bridge here, London Bridge, crossing the river, demolished in the middle of the 18th century. So the houses were demolished on it. And the well-known townscape of London, very poorly represented with St. Paul's there. And we do have some maps. This map, quite a good map, early 18th century map, which shows the extent of London on the north of the river, and a little bit of movement along, a little bit of development along the south. Now, in terms of the book trade, we obviously know in terms of the central location of London. And of course, the 18th century is the area of extraordinary expansion. I hope my cursor can be shown here, but in the 18th century, the whole west side around what is now Oxford Street and the Strand was developed. This is the Georgian 18th century aspect of London. But the traditional heart is here, the city of London, where these stars are. And you can see the central points I've put really in relation to the central area of the book trade. Round St. Paul's Cathedral, Stationers' Hall next to it, which policed the book trade, Paternosteros, which we'll see a lot in a moment, it's the north of St. Paul's Cathedral, and then the financial centre, which it still is today, in the city around the Royal Exchange. And it was really circumscribed or defined by the Roman Wall, which I don't know whether you can see my cursor going around, but that's really the old Roman town of London. Now, there are, in addition, amongst the many problems, there are three particular problems of reconstruction at the heart of that very heart of the business of books in London. The destruction, which is caused by the Great Fire of London, which completely burnt the area in 1666. The Blitz, that is the bombing in the Second World War in 1941. And then I've put circa 2000. Well, it's more complicated than that. It's actually rebuilding after the bombing in the 1960s, which was then all torn down and rebuilt after a very controversial intervention by Prince Charles, but I won't go there, in the early part of the 21st century, around 2000, and I'll be showing that in a moment. So here is the real problem, the first two problems. On the top there, the area around St. Paul's after the Great Fire, the Blitz of 1941, and then in the second bottom part of the screen there, the Great Fire. As you can see, the billowing. This was a representation of the billowing clouds of fire in 1666. The fire destroying the old Cathedral of St. Paul's, people fleeing from the city, and that's the view from across the other bank of the city as it burnt down at the end of the 17th century. With so many booksellers' records, Stationers' Hall, St. Paul's Cathedral, absolutely everything went. Nothing in the centre survived. This is the extent of the fire. You can see there around this area here. So it's almost the whole of the old heart. And that was a map that was produced in the 17th century, again, showing the destructed area from the fire. This shows a comparison. There's in red, the area completely destroyed by the fire. There's the city wall. And then you could compare again by the Blitz in this one down here, where again, there's St. Paul's with a cross. Again, this whole area all around it. St. Paul's, of course, the new St. Paul's, miraculously survived, mostly. One small bomb hit it, but mostly survived in 1940, but not our area, the area we're most interested in for the book trade around. So we do have this problem. And there you see devastating. These are the bookshops of the area around St. Paul's in 1941. And you can see, I'm going to be showing you maps in a moment, particularly of this area here, which is Paternosteros, and all the printers' areas coming off here. And this is taken from the roof of St. Paul's in 1941. And there's just one single building surviving there. Everything else has gone. It shows you the height of the buildings, which I'll be talking about, but it shows the extent. It's one of my favorite photographs from the period of the destruction in the period. There we are. And this is how I remember it as a child as well, actually. In the 1960s, a lot of the area still was a big bomb site and was not built over. And so our very street pattern, the actual evidence of where the streets were, let alone the buildings, have gone. And our third problem is a modern one. If you go to London today, this is a very modern photograph of how it is today. It's been rebuilt, but in a strange approximation of a sort of classical Georgian modern. This is what is sort of, I think, rather preposterous. Paternoster Square near St. Paul's. There's the chapter house, the Georgian chapter house, which was rebuilt there. But the rest is really not representing what was there before. So we've got a real problem here, that the original street pattern is very different today to what it was. And of course, all the records of the booksellers were destroyed as well. And so we've got to think about the different sorts of sources that we might be able to bring together to reconstruct the area. And anyway, even if some of the areas survive physically, when we're thinking about a bookscape, then we do need a lot of very independent and almost sort of left field, a lot of interesting sort of lateral thinking about what sorts of sources could we have to recreate it. So I'm going to try and show you in a moment the sort of selection of sources that we can begin to reconstruct what I've tried to do with the bookscape. Now, to some extent, there is a bit of physical evidence still left. And we can see that here in certain parts of London, where you get a sense of the narrow courts and courtyards that are surviving. And we can do a little bit of comparison between those and certainly early 19th century. There are very few, there are surprisingly few actually, and you'll see them reproduced all over the place because they are so few. But we do have some pictures. I'm putting in also just a reminder to you, because this is important, about the narrow space that's required for the printing press, the very small site, but also the extent to which the printing press is at ground level. And these structures are required, you know, it needs very firm, very firmly to be secured within the building. And I'll talk about the interiors in a moment, but that's just a little reminder before we go on. But the courtyards, of course, are very small, very individually small sized individual buildings. And we can compare, this is Fleet Street, which we'll come on to a moment, in 1790, with photographs from the 19th century. And that will be an important point. At the very end of my talk today, I shall come back to how we might use 19th century photographs. But for the moment, we'll just think about engravings. And there are a number of engravings which can show the height, the sort of disposition of the shops, how the shop fronts, what the shop fronts looked like, and how they were all in fact reconstructed after the Great Fire in most cases, particularly around churches where many of the original book peddlers had their stalls, and how some of the advertising was also put onto was also put on them. So we do have some obvious visual representations. Now, another different source would be, of course, well known to you, the use of imprints on the books themselves, the title pages. And interestingly, and a lot of work in England, I'd be very interested to know whether this is the case in Hispanic countries too. A lot of work has done between the relationship between the words printed and sold, printed for, printed by, printed and sold by, and what that means in terms of the relationship between the individuals as shown on the imprint. My verdict after many, many years of work is you have to be very careful indeed in interpreting those words about the relationship between printers and booksellers. However, from our point of view at the moment, the most important thing is the address where they were. And the problem here is that in this early modern period, we don't have a number of the streets are not numbered, the properties are not numbered. And so we have to find the exact, we need different evidence to find exactly where these booksellers were. Now, there were early trade directories in the early 18th century. Here is one, this is probably the best one, which shows a little bit of evidence about here, a list of principal booksellers. But they're very selective, they're very inexact, they're rather unreliable. So it's rather difficult to somehow get a sense of it. But sometimes the accompanying text is helpful and useful for us. Now, another problem is using ESTC, that is in English, the English short title catalogue, to identify those booksellers and printers. Because unfortunately, for the most popular and important books, ESTC does not give the whole number of the collaborators. So here is an example. At the bottom here, we see the imprint from the book of Samuel Johnson, Lives of the English Poets. And here are all the collaborators. Here are all the printers and booksellers who combined. But as you see on the EST entry, all you get is Rivington, Davis, White and Son, Longman Law, and 35 others. So you can't do a search. They're just not there. I see Loretta's holding up her hands in horror there. That was so another source, which is interesting, are court records, legal records, particularly some of my favorite booksellers who came to physical blows in the street. But they're very interesting, but they often don't show address. And remember, we've lost the business records, of course. This is my point. We've lost so much in the fires. We don't have the individual book selling records. We don't have, almost all the business records have gone. Other countries, other capital cities, other centers of trading are much luckier than we are on this one. So there's a lot of reconstruction. We have a few, but we have, and the stationers' company records were saved, and there are some important exceptions. But in terms of the records of the individual firms, we have very, very few. But you can see how difficult this is. A court record. Look at it. I spent hours and hours falling over these. And of course, these aren't just the court records of booksellers. These are court records of everybody. So excuse me. So you've got to find your booksellers within them. It's a really impossible sort of search. Excuse me. Sometimes we have incidental, of course we do, incidental references to, excuse me, to where the booksellers were. And sometimes these can be quite amusing as well as helpful, but they're also quite few and far between. Then another source are trade cards, these lovely trade cards which were given out, which have survived. And we have a wonderful collection, particularly in the Ambrose Hill collection, which shows sometimes not only the individual shops, a little bit of detail about where they were. They can be useful as well. But the problem is, unless we know exactly where they are, these are all random and rather difficult sources to use. Excuse me. These are also more of the trade directories, but the problem is with the trade directories, look how general they are. I don't know how anyone used them at the time. This is one by Mortimer, one by Lands. They don't really tell you where they are. You've also got to know your person before you go there. They can't on their own supply much help. But they do tell you, if you can find who the total inhabitants of London were, then you might be able to know who was a bookseller, or who was a printer, or who was a binder, etc. And so they can begin to be a bit useful, together with some interior images. But you have to be very careful, because of course these interior images, like the circulating library from the 1750s, is entirely imagined, and it is promotional. It's intended to lure country people in. It almost certainly didn't look anything like that. And finally, we have what I call incidental evidence, in which or something that's actually been prepared for something completely different can be used for our purposes once we know where a bookshop is. Now this, my example, is the funeral of Lord Nelson on the 9th of January 1806, which was hugely illustrated. You can see the cortege here with Nelson's coffin. But what was of interest to us is the building on the left here, which was a bookshop, strangely crowded here with all these people watching on. But by close up, at least we can see Newbury's bookshop, the bookshop of Elizabeth Newbury, actually one of those interesting women booksellers on that area in St. Paul's. And of course, this is the centre that we were talking about, around St. Paul's Cathedral, this traditional centre for the book trade in London, where we've got very little evidence. And so if we put these together, we're still lacking problems. And for me, the most important source that I've used is the records of taxation. They are annual taxation records, which we could call land tax or poor law tax sometimes. Basically, they are taxation of land for money that then goes to the poor. I was told when I began they hadn't survived, and then about 15 years ago, thousands were brought up from the basement. And from where I'm speaking here in Cambridge, I have miles of microfilm of these things, and a huge project that I undertook with colleagues to look through these records. They give the number of they give the name and number of the householder and who is occupying the property. And from this, we're able to find out by using other records which numbers, because of course the names don't say who they are. They don't say whether they're a bookseller or not. We need to know that by using all these other records. But the great thing about it is that every year between the end of the 17th century and about 1820, the taxmen went around the same route. So you can see exactly the same route. And so long as you actually find a particular landmark, like I have suggested here, a tavern, an inn, or a church, for example, then we can start to map the route and be able to plot where they are. Here is an example of those taxation records. You can see how simple they are. They're not going to tell you whether they're a bookseller or not. They're going to tell you just the name. So you have a whole variety of trades here. You might have a butcher or a candlestick maker or a glover or a grocer or any trader, but they will show you the name of the occupier. And it's very important economically to remember this is an occupier. It's not an owner. This is not the owner. We're talking about rental value of the property as well, and the amount of the tax that's paid. But of course, from our point of view, we want to know where these people are. And the same order that they're written in means that they are neighbors. They're going around one by one, and it's also 3D. Now, if you use a map from the 18th century, map, this is a map from the 1790s of Paternosteros. Again, this central row here. St. Paul's is down here on the right. You can see St. Paul's was written there. This is the central Paternosteros. We can begin to actually map and sometimes use other records which come in, fire insurance records, to get a sense of the site. Then we can plot it like this. And remember, the taxman is going up and down stairs as well as going left to right through the street. So it's a 3D fascinating, because you might have an owner or an occupier on a second story above the lower story. This is Little Britain, just to the north of Paternosteros, just to give you an example of what we can do, which shows the tax route. There he goes. There's the little man going around the route, and the red one in one. And he will do that for a year between the late 17th century and the early 19th century. But look at the density. This is much more complicated. This is Fleet Street as it's growing in the 18th century, and I'll come back to Fleet Street in a little while. Fascinating. And here you've got, here we can see again the taxmen going around all those little areas. That's one particular ward. We've got another ward here in yellow, just to show you the extraordinary density of the route that he takes. And from that, we can reconstruct or begin to reconstruct the internal aspects of it, where we've got some surviving records of the disposition of the interior. Now, going back to our destroyed area around St. Paul's, again, where the destruction was, we now have to look completely at the streetscape again and try to reconstruct the mapping from using the 18th century commercial directories, the maps, these extraordinarily important taxation records, and we can begin to actually understand what the commercial activity around a book site can be. So it combines all these different types of activity around, particularly around the area of St. Paul's and Paternosteros, which by the end of the 18th century was the most densely concentrated street of booksellers, not necessarily printers, but booksellers in the whole of Europe. And this is what we can then begin to reconstruct. So here we have St. Paul's in the middle, and Paternosteros, which we saw was completely destroyed. And the blue is every trade that was associated with bookselling throughout the 18th century. This is, as I said in the earlier thing, a compendium of the site. But we can also start to break down the individual trades. So here we've got Paternosteros as well, and we can get a sense of their position. But magically, marvelously, one result of the Great Fire of 1666 was that the owners of the buildings which had been completely lost obviously wanted to reclaim their land. And so in a year, back 2 or 3 years after 1666, we have fire court records. Registry, I've translated it as a tribunal of the proprietor after the fire. And the wonderful thing about this is, just look at this, it gives you the exact dimensions, the exact 22 feet to there, and you can see the size of the individual properties then. Now, we don't know whether these are all booksellers, but we can begin to move from 1666, and we can then begin also to put in the different sorts of trades that we have, and we can build up a whole string of heritage. So this, if you watch this close, this is going to change over the century. Can you see it's going every 10 years through? Watch the colors change. Here we are in 1750, 1760. Watch the red is interesting. The red are the binders. And we've got a little group of binders who all come to one area, so that by 1795, we've got a little red area there. I can do that again for you if you like. 1710, we start, and you can see the trades building through the 18th century, the different trades, 1720, 1730, 1740, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90. So we can study this in great detail. And there's a lot of very interesting consequences that I could go into here, which relate to the fast changing tenancy. The average tenancy of any of these buildings by a bookseller is 7 years. They are always bookshops, but they keep changing between bookshops, and particularly with Stationers' Hall in that precinct looking over. And we've got a sense here again of the way of the trade signs. Something which was one interesting conclusion from this was that when you had a trade sign, you didn't need a number, because if you had a number of a street, it was a problem. If you put, I was number 62 Paternosteros, and then 7 years later you moved, you were no longer at number 62. But if you had, I'm at the Rose and Crown in Paternosteros, you just moved your trade sign. So everyone would know still where you were. It didn't matter. So in fact, I would suggest that numbering was held back, was a sort of handicap, because trade signs were more useful. You could be more flexible and change. Now, a series of slides now I'm going to show, which I'm going to go through quite quickly because they relate really to individual histories of things that I worked on, and are probably of interest to people who are interested in some of these particular traders. But the point is, and I hope you'll see the point from just this illustration, is that you can build up a whole history of a particular bookshop, of how it exchanged hands between important booksellers during the 17th century and then the 18th century. And so for the first time, we can gain a sense of the memory and the history of a particular place, because obviously intellectually and in terms of the literary products, some of these individual sites are associated with a particular type of publishing or printing, whether it be of a particular religion or particular ethnicity in a way, or particular politics. And we can also then, with such a site, and we're looking here at this interesting one, which became number 58 Paternosteros, we can sometimes get another, here's a quote about what it actually looked like: the double arch, two doors, presses, print presses, shelves, well actually those were book presses actually, shelves, counting house, benches, tables and stools and irons, etc. We can build it up for others. This is the Rivington family, who were really very important religious publishers, high Anglican publishers in the 18th century. They moved around rapidly around this area, but they inhabited important shops which go right back to the age of the Puritans in the late 16th century. Very, very important shops. And for the first time, we can build up a continuum, a pedigree, if you like, a pedigree of occupancy of where they were. And as I said, also, because of the fire maps, we can get a sense of the actual size of these buildings. Sir John Summerson, the great architectural historian, talked about the insistent verticality of London. And that's really true. These are very, very small sites, but they're extremely tall. So, and it explains, for example, in Benjamin Franklin's memoirs of being a printer in London, he talks about running up and down the stairs with his type all the time. And we can begin to see that as well. And you can get some sense also of the foreign printers who are coming in. I'm going to go through this quite quickly. Again, with an idea of a particular pedigree in a particular shop. Sometimes it can illustrate a particularly interesting publication history, for example, of Robinson Crusoe and the founding of the Longmans and the Churchills, which has long been a mystery to us. But this can show, it can actually give an example of where, in here we've got the famous Longman Swan combining with the Longman Ship, and how it combines in one particular bookshop at the end of Paternosteros. Again, these are individual histories. I'm rushing through this, but it gives a sense of how, in terms of the changing trades, we can now describe in a way this bookscape and get a sense of what's happening within. In my first book about this area, I was it was almost, I didn't pay enough attention to the extent to which so many booksellers did not have a printing press, and how individual printers were used as contract printers by the booksellers, while some did combine printing and bookselling. And we can begin to get some sense of that over the century as well. There's a very interesting geographical theory as well about how one trade attracts others. So if you look at the red again, the binders, you can see this area again has suddenly attracted great attention in the middle and these narrow streets. Now, I haven't got much time to talk about the intellectual production, but I did want to draw your attention, particularly in the 18th century, to the production of magazines, which produced a different sort of production, a production schedule, often known as magazine fortnight. And again, in terms of the extraordinary production of periodicals and magazines, Paternosteros, that hugely important dense street of bookselling to the north, this street, produced extremely exceptionally important sites. This site in red here, numbers as it were, we're numbering them for the sake of it, 18, 17, 16, was the home to a whole series of really important magazine booksellers. I'm just going to rush through this. But what's interesting as well is that you can see how different trades were also side by side. So look at number 18 here. They're not all, you have a bookseller, you can see how they move quickly. 17 days are empty, but you've got a linen draper, you've got a glover. Somewhere I think you've even got a butcher, yes, somewhere up here at the same time. So you have a versatility of the actual site. So against what I'm talking about of a particular pedigree of a shop, you also have sites which change hands between trades and illustrate how people would have to move with their equipment, with their printing press or with their shelves or with their internal furniture. There's much more I could say about this. And finally, just in terms of the intellectual or what's the productivity of these very small sites, one also has a sense of the variety, the huge variety of productions that are coming from here. And in a very small and dense area, the difference between, as I think I've already said, high Anglicanism, Protestant dissenters, some foreign printers and booksellers as well, and increasingly specialists like Elizabeth Newberry that we saw earlier, and her kinsman, John Newberry, selling children's books for the first time. So that we've got a number of very different types of publication coming from a very densely populated area. Now, I'm going to move through this quickly. It's just making my point again about how cheek by jowl you have so many different types of publication, but particularly in this case, the magazines. And I just wanted to draw attention as well, given the density of this, to think about memory and how the production at this time of the history of the book trades itself. It's extremely inventive. You've got some of the early illustrations of actually what's going on in terms of type founding and printing in an encyclopedic way to get some sense of the industry of this area, but also some sense of on the particular site of the Bookscape itself. And I'm just moving through quickly because what I want to do is get to an idea of what the trade of books is really about, and how in this area that we were seeing, we can set this against what we know in terms of the number of printing presses. You see this rise of number of printing presses of houses through the 18th century, and this invention of a memory. So here we have Ames' typographical memoirs of 1749, with their entirely made up portraiture of the great fathers of the book trade, of Grafton, of Pinson, of Caxton, and others. And so you have a memorialization. There's John Day, the great Protestant printer, a memorialization of this very area with a sense of that pedigree, which we can now reconstruct based around particular bookshops. And we can now contrast the reality with the invented. And the other thing to note, of course, is that by the end of the 18th century, more and more of the booksellers are not living over the shop anymore. They're profiting from the trade. They're buying funny little villas like this one to the north of the town. They've become the sort of gentlemen bookseller, sometimes bookseller printer, and Paternosteros, and the vertical shops are now tend to be devoted entirely to trade, and fewer booksellers are actually living over the shop. That's my opening picture again. Here's William Strahan, the printer, on the left, and a rather nice one of Samuel Richardson, the printer, on the right. Strahan becomes an MP, buys an estate, big estate outside London. Richardson stays a little bit near Fleet Street, but also is typical of someone who is what one would see as in terms of socially mobile in a different part of London. Now, I just want to draw in a closing part of my talk. I've concentrated on that focus on the centre of London, around St. Paul's, but of course it's expanding westward. Here is Ludgate Hill with Temple Bar, very near the Inns of Court. Very, very interesting other parts of London to explore in relation to the book trade. And my more recent work has concentrated, my book was really much, as I said, around this central area where those stars are around St. Paul's, but I've done much more interesting work recently on Fleet Street and the Strand and its extension westward. I've just published something recently about this particular area in Fleet Street. We don't need to see these people moving around again. We've got that. Here it is. There's a contemporary area of the Strand. And what's really very interesting about this is where you've got a number of very different, a huge variety of different trades, but within the different trades, a number of different booksellers, binders, stationers, particularly of different nationalities. So you've got a lot of German booksellers here, a lot of French booksellers, a lot of luxury booksellers, changing venues, and off the Strand, really well-known names like Vaillant and so forth, producing an extraordinary variety of different wares in different languages by 1800, by the end of the 18th century. I just published something recently on that, particularly if you look at the red, John Norris, who traded from 1730 until his death in 1780, a 50-year career. He moves around. You can see under there, there's various little bits of coloured map. He moves around the same with the Strand as well, and he becomes really important in terms of a salon, a literary meeting point. And there's an awful lot that one can now discover in terms of that, a literary bookscape, in terms of the connections between the individual traders. So what of the future? I'll just close with where we're going and where I'm taking this project now. So for the future, I said that I'd return to photographs, using 19th century photographs, of which we have many, of course, with the advent of photography. These are from the 1870s and 1880s. And okay, they're not about the early modern period, of course, but nevertheless, now we've identified the individual properties. Many of them have not changed, and at least until the destruction of 1941 and the war will be there. So we can use those photographs. Now, this is a mock-up. You can see this is individual sections. So now that we know which property is which and which bookshop we're interested in, we can splice it together with the individual photographs onto a street. This is Paternosteros, excuse me, reconstructed using 19th century photographs. Things, of course, have changed, but we nevertheless get a sense of the height of these buildings, which we don't know because they've been destroyed, by using it, and get different ways, and particularly interesting on the shop fronts that were there in one particular street. And by doing this, as I've just been saying, we can try to bring up an exact sense of where they were, and we can also reconstruct a walk down the street. So in future, it will be possible to walk down the street, to reconstruct it with photographs, but also to go into the individual shops themselves and possibly press and click on something to bring up the list of the pedigrees, the earlier occupants, the succession of occupants in the individual site, and indeed also the space as it looks like, and the number of publications that there are. So this is where we are at the moment. And with luck, this will now come up, yep, and we will be able to walk down the street. We are now walking down Paternosteros as reconstructed, and we can stop if we want on our route. Oh, well, we'll have to go back again. Doesn't quite work on a PowerPoint. But we can go down here. Of course, a lot of this is imaginary reconstruction, But the point is to be able to provide a platform, a digital platform, which will be able to show the individual site and be able to perhaps use that as a way that we can actually reconstruct the succession of the booksellers in the individual site and the production of the books that come from those shops. I'll let it come to the end. You can glance left and right. This is Paternosteros that has not been seen since before the Second World War and the bombing. There we go. And indeed, if you go to the university, you can put on a 3D pair of spectacles and you can do what you did there, and you can actually try and sort of actually feel your way and walk into the shops if you like. We may be going a little bit too far, but it's an interesting idea of thinking about a bookscape and thinking about those publications. There we are. You've got your 3D glasses. This is what you can do if you actually go into the room at the moment. So there we are. I hope that's been of some interest. I've gone through it very quickly. I can say a great deal more about the sources that are used and also some of the other problems. For example, oh goodness, there's a lot I could say about it in terms of the sociology. There are problems here in terms of putting down, for example, only the occupier, the head occupier of the premises. So something that's left out of the account are the other people who are working above. And that's particularly true of women, that women were hugely important in terms of the finishing trades, but we get very little sense of them. We get very little sense of some of the servants. There are other problems as well, but there are also quite important sort of pluses too that I've left out in terms of what one can talk about the movement between the trades and the intellectual interests of different networks, and of the networks that become more visible, that weren't visible before, the networks of traders, which is hugely important, not just to the social aspect of it and the political aspect, but also to the economics of how this industry actually worked in relation to wholesaling and the trading and the swapping of titles between premises, some of which we can now understand are actually next to one another. But I will stop there and we can change screens, and I'd love comments and questions, and I'll come on to my other screen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. It's really amazing, and well, that kind of fiction at the end when you can walk down the street and touch it. I have a basic question. Maybe it's more conceptual than a real question, but a map is normally in a moment, no? So how do you build history? That means evolution, that means a while in the time. Above all, thinking that in cities as London and as Mexico, the places changes. The buildings fell down, were rebuilt. So that means how can you build a map within history with a historical dimension?
Well, as I tried to show there, you have a snapshot every year.
A snapshot every year. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, a snapshot of every year. So you can see every single year and get a different map. So you can have one for 1701, 1702,
mm-hmm.
And so you can plot, as I showed there, the changing trades, the changing occupiers from one year, to another. And then if you focus on the individual premises, you can see
mm-hmm.
where it was rebuilt and when it wasn't rebuilt. And so that is one of the wonders, I think, of being able to do this digitally as well, because you can actually do that mapping in a way which escapes exactly what you're saying. It escapes that flatness of the map. You can have this temporality in the map.
in the map. That I think that's the magic about it, no? Because you
Yes.
go beyond the normal possibilities of geography, no?
Yes, and I think we learn a lot from geographers at the moment. One of the things which is really important is to be able to learn things from our other disciplines as well, that show, you know, how they overcome these problems. But you're absolutely right that this temporal issue is a really important one, and it's one that was really, as I tried to say, really important at the time. The sense of temporality at the time, the sense of change at the time was really important. So change and continuity, as I said at the beginning, are really important concepts here.
Of course. I don't know, no sé si alguno de ustedes tenga una pregunta, otra pregunta para el Dr. Raven, ¿no? ¿No? Si no, yo tengo otra pregunta. Ah, bueno, Manuel, adelante, adelante.
Ahí me escuchan, sí, ¿verdad? Okay, thank you, Professor. It was very interesting. I cannot help thinking in Mexico. It's almost the same. All this situation about the 20 different shoppings in the same building is actual Mexico City. When you go to Mexico City, it's exactly the same. I feel you described Mexico City nowadays on your talk. But in Mexico, we have different things. I mean, we haven't had this Blitz. We have some buildings, but one of the sources that have helped me to reconstruct some libraries, some bookstores, are the inventories. That is, I tried to put a measure of every book, and if you have 3,000 books, you can figure how space you need to have that amount of books. So I don't know if you have found something like that. Maybe you can cross the wonderful references you have found with these inventories and have an idea of how many space you need to have a stock of, for example, 3,000 books.
Yes, that's very interesting. Now, of course, as I said, we've lost a lot of the individual business records of the booksellers, as you understood. But if you think of we can, of course, calculate from the catalogs the number of books that they published, although not the number of copies. So we might know the titles, but we haven't got the printing records. So it's a little bit dangerous to calculate the number of the size of the stock just from the number of titles, because we do not know the size of the individual titles, because the printing records, was it an edition of 1,000 or 500 or just a few privately printed? We don't know. Now, we could then guess and go for an average, say an average edition size of 750. And so you could then calculate the stock on the number of titles times 750 copies. And then you get a sense of how many books they produced. But you know, Manuel, there's a real problem here, because we don't know then, you know, how fast the stock was moving.
Yeah.
And also, at least in London. So this is really interesting to know about Mexico City, because in London, most of the stock was not kept in these shops. In addition to the shops, what the maps show are sheds and shared warehousing, which also comes about from this mapping that I've been doing. And so the mapping, the very last thing I think I said in this presentation about how you can think about the economics of this, is about the networks and the economic sharing that's going on. So in Stationers' Hall that I showed, for example, booksellers rented space under Stationers' Hall to keep their stock there. And of course, that was good because they didn't have to pay their own insurance as well. Yeah. So I won't go on, because I realize I'm speaking at length in English, but it's a complicated one. But I'm not sure that you could, although one could get a sense of the size of the business, relating the size of the stock to the premises has many problems and difficulties with it.
Yeah, I said that because in my case, I was able to do this because I this inventory where this bookstore tells me, well, the bookstore had 3,000 books, and I figured it's a very big library, a bookstore. But then I just counted the number of books and the size, because the size was the same it was a standard. And the first question I made myself was, it is impossible to have this bookstore on this tiny shop. So there must be a warehouse or something. But then I started counting books and then the copies and the size of the books. And I realized that there was no need to a warehouse. So there are different kind of sources, but in this case, I think that the space is a very important aspect of history of the book. And it's, I think we should explore this more often.
That's a good point. Yes, absolutely. I agree with you. And you raise an important point, but there's obviously a very great difference between your shops in Mexico and these shops, where the most successful will not keep their stock in their shop. Their shop becomes an area for discussion, as a literary salon, sometimes for printing if they print, but not necessarily for wholesale storage. And that also explains why they want to move, why they're moving. Your sellers may not move very much, perhaps. Perhaps they stay in the same place.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Muchas gracias y por la pregunta y también la respuesta. No sé si haya otra pregunta. Yo tengo una duda, y es un poco sobre el rastreo de fuentes que lleva a cabo el Dr. Raven, ¿no? En particular esa que se vincula con la historia tributaria, ¿no? With text history. Because Mexico, if we think coldly about it, is more like India or Australia towards London as a situation. Then I think if we would find something like London, it's more Madrid, because it was the head of the empire, no? And so what's the case in Australia and India about tributary history, about text history? Is it as easy to find as it was? Well, it wasn't easy for you to find it in London. You had to search a lot for it, but yeah. Could it be found also in Australia or in India?
Yes, it can. I mean, India is more interesting in a way. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be disparaging to Australia, but India is, of course, India is older, and the connections with the Indian colonial India is older in terms of the East India Company in the 18th century, and so you have, in fact, the shop that I showed really of most interest in Paternosteros, Longmans, for example, develops three branch headquarters in India, in Madras, in Calcutta, and I'm missing one, and the records of Longmans printing in India we have surviving. It's one of the exceptions, actually. And by the end of the 19th century, certainly we can get some sense of the trade. And there is a good survival in India of some of the records relating to the agents and to the points of distribution. And of course, India becomes very important because it becomes a distribution point also to East Africa and to points east, so Indochina, and in an odd way, in a paradoxical way, it might be easier to look at the Bookscape in some of those towns than it is in London. London is formidably difficult. This was as I've tried to show, because of the fire and the destruction. There's a lot of interesting work going on in Paris at the moment using notarial records to reconstruct. There is also reconstruction of space in North American towns. I've done a little bit of this, but there's some very interesting work going on to reconstruct as it were, the Bookscape or the sites of publishing in Boston and also New Haven. I've done a lot in Charleston, and a research student of mine is doing more work there. So I think the verdict is that a different place, a different city, has a different a different range of problems, of source and evidential problems to overcome. They are peculiar and individual, often to the particular place, to the legal system, which leaves different sorts of records, to the taxation system, which fortunately came to my rescue in London, leaving annual records, to whether business records of the premises of the individual businesses survive. They don't in London because of the fires often, but in other places they are luckier, unless they had a lot of rats or mice or disease or whatever, or people just haven't saved them. So, it's a very interesting question, and it's peculiar, I think, to the individual town.
Thank you very much. Of course, I think every country has his own editorial history. That's something we also have to talk about later. But and tax history and that kind of economics aspects, of what we need to make book history. Yes.
Yes, I'm sorry, but what is interesting as well in that is how at the time, in the 18th century or the 19th century, what I was trying to show in a way is how at the time that difference, that physical difference, is also understood, and it becomes part of how the book trade is memorialized. So the types of records that we have, and the types of physical structures that they were, and the types of trading, is also at the time integrated into the writing of the history of the trade at the time. They become connected to that idea of escape. Now, I don't know whether that would be true. It'd be really interesting to know about, what histories of printing and publishing in Mexico City, for example, there are that relate to the sort of thing that we've been discussing earlier about the configuration of the trade.
Yes, of course, and maybe a question that will help our specialists in digital projection of the history of our legacy is maybe what software did you use for that projection?
I'm no expert. I collaborate with my colleagues. I mean, I was looking for it so I could show you on screen. Somewhere in my office here, I have a large fold-out piece of paper, which was my beginning. It's it looks like an 18th century document, and it's how I started by plotting. And then I used microfilms, and then we put everything onto Microsoft Access, and that was important as I understand it, because I'm not a great expert on this. As I understand it, what was really important was that the individual records should be kept sort of independent, so that you could always move so you weren't a prisoner of the technology, and that was very important. So you could move it as the technology changed, as different platforms changed. You could move your independent piece of data, so you weren't, and that was really, really important. So I had a very good a research assistant who put those data, and that enabled the making of the map. Now the digital reconstruction, walking down the street, is entirely done by my colleagues in the computer laboratory in the university, and they are absolutely brilliant. I provide the materials, but how they do the 3D thing, I haven't the slightest idea.
Okay, so that's a big and huge collaborative work, no? It's taking things together, but with a very rigorous organization, no, in separate, no, files of every year of the maps, no, so you can build it after together as a complex object, no, but that's really wonderful.
The build maps that I showed in terms of the colors change, that's simple. I did that myself. That's just a map transferred onto PowerPoint, and you just fill in, you just transfer your research onto a map. That's not a problem. But in the future, this idea of being able to click onto a property to show every book that was published there, to see what the interior looked like, to walk down the street. That involves, you know, and be able to do that in 3D. That involves quite complicated, very complicated computer technology. But it combines two things, it seems to me. It combines two functions. One is a research retrieval function, so that you actually have an idea of what was published in a particular site. You know, so it's going beyond a short title catalogue. It's actually doing something which is a research possibility. And the second other function is just to have it's, in a sense, it's more fun, but it's to get a sense of the environment, what sources can do, to have a sense of that external, you know, bookscape, if you like, and the interior one, as much as we can sort of reimagine it, particularly for London, where it's lost. Now, of course, there might be places where it's not lost. We don't need to do it because, as you were saying, your buildings might survive. And you might actually go to the real site, but we can't.
Of course. And extrapolating, do you think that kind of reconstruction can be or should be possible, for instance, for the 20th century? Or what would be an obstacle to use it for a more contemporary period?
Yes, I beg your pardon, when you said twinning center, I didn't quite understand.
The
Sorry.
20th century, so for the years maybe
Yes. Well, if
1946 or 45.
If it is needed, you know, there might not be a need if the buildings are there to do it, but it was needed for us because that picture there that I'm seeing, at least on screen, of my front of my book of Paternosteros, that's the only view we have of that street before we put the photographs and everything else together. So we had no idea what it was really like. Excuse me. But for other places in, you know, I don't know. I mean, it may be my colleagues in Tokyo are quite interesting. The book area around Tokyo, which has been lost entirely through some war damage, but also through earthquakes and through fire and through shops being just pulled down as well. That would be a very interesting challenge to reconstruct that because of loss. So it's really about you know, lost. It's where something is lost and you want to reconstruct it in that way physically. It can be very important, but it's worth doing as well in relation, even if the buildings have survived, as I said, but because if you want to look at the relationship between the different trades and really to identify precisely what trades we're talking about. You know, was it a bookseller? Was it a printer? Was it a bookbinder? Ink maker and activities. And you do get a sense, you know, you get a sense Paternosteros of the bustling activities. For, you know, just one example, just to the only a few meters to the north of Paternosteros is Newgate Market, full of cows and bulls and cattle. But of course, the products of that meat market, the hides, the skin, was used for the bookbinders. And the fat, even though it was quite disgusting as well, was often used in terms of some of the other trades around there, the oilmen and the like, to keep the presses going at night, all the candle wax that was required to keep the press going. So you get a sense of an environment and of a community in which there's a relationship between one trade and another, not just the trades within the book trades, but how the book trades relate to other trades which are important for them.
Of course, it's really interesting. Many of our colleagues who work on Mexican bibliography of the 20th century are for instance, trying to map the translations of poetry, no, or the cultural journalism, and I think in Mexico City, a big moment of fracture is the earthquake of 1985. You know, that changed a lot of habits. For instance, to take what you said, no, that the bookshops were also places where they didn't have the stock because they were places where authors and readers came together and could have a dialogue. I think the importance of the literary cafes in Mexico City is also a place where that bookscape can be, yes, or can, yes, exist. No, and so I think.
I'm sorry, and there's a very interesting point that's come out of that because when I do that for the 18th century, and as I said, I'm interested in the Strand, in the area in the Strand particularly, where you've got all these very interesting people working together. I'm looking at individual books and how they're translated, and the community of translators around John Norris, as I said, who traded for 50 years on the Strand. Fascinating things coming out of that in terms of literary conversations. But when you look at some of the evidence that survives, we have got, because that area was not burnt. Part of the Strand was not burnt, so we've got a little bit more left there. And there's some of the individual letters and correspondence. You look at the letters and the correspondence and you say, well, hold on, why? There are really important things missing from the correspondence, from the letters. Well, of course, the reason is, if you're a neighbor, you just go to the person next door and you talk to him or her. So a lot of it is done through. So if you've got a very close community like that, that's doing whether it's talking about the latest literature or you're not writing letters to one another. You've got business agreements, but you haven't got that. So in a sense, when you've got a very close and dense, you lose a lot of the evidence because it's just spoken.
Of course, and when we go back, for instance, in the Mexican 18th century, well, I think the academies are very important places, and some of the convents, no, the monasteries that are maybe more open, such as the Oratorio de San Felipe Neri, no, that was whose library was a place, you know, where they undoubtedly came together and had chats about sacred rhetorics, but also about any topic of the moment. So I think our Mexican maps should involve book selling, but also places, you know, where they came together and had, you know, that kind of exchanges about book culture. No? So that's really interesting, and I think your talk in your conference today has moved a lot of inspirations for us.
Well, but thank you so much.
Manuel? Mm-hmm.
I have two more questions, if it's not, si no es un abuso de mi parte. It's about the things I'm thinking of reading your text. You said earlier this conference about these ESTCs, the England and the Universal, and there's a problem here because you said, I think in your book, what is a history of the book, that we need to start study circulation, not only production, and I think it's very important because how to do that if the only catalogs we have, they don't show this information how you showed earlier. I mean, we have only cataloged very few things that we need. So how to start this history about circulation and not only production? And the second one is that maybe if we can have the pleasure of having you in Mexico City soon, I will take you to downtown Mexico so you can see how this works. It's exactly how you describe it is how it works in Mexico today. It's a building with 30 different negocios, I would say negocios in English, 30 different shops.
Business shops.
And there is a very important thing about this social dimension that cannot be perceived on your records. That is, for instance, you said that the female places in there it was very important. It is not very you can't see that. So the social dimension, I think about this Mexican nowadays, the circumstances about how a seller can sell something in a building with 30 different shops and the next building is the same. So there are a very special and a popular person in Mexico that we call Coyote. It's a person who before you get to any building, he goes to you and he offers something to you, so you can sell, or you can sell this product for him and not from other different bookstore, for instance. So this Coyote is one of these social dimension that you cannot perceive on these records, but I can imagine that these all books, this impressive number of bookstores, how they could sell something without having a person down the streets offering these books. We also have this in New Spain, Corredor de Libros. That's a book runner, something like that. The translation is not very precise, but I think they needed some kind of person who promote his, or if there is not this kind of person, that means that there are a network of selling. I don't know. Maybe you can talk about these two questions. Thank you. I'm sorry about it.
Maybe we could call it a reel, no? Like a hunting metaphor, that the people who are first trying to hook the client for for some bookseller, no, who's upstairs, for instance, no, that's in Mexico in any kind of business, you know, when you sell cars or books or perfumes.
Let me answer. There's two main questions there. Let me answer the first one. The first one that Manuel said is very, very important. That is the circulation of books that are not new. And we do have some glimpses of that through other types of record. And of course, there is one very famous in particular. I'm sorry, I haven't got a picture of it here. There's one very famous, the store of James Lackington, which he boasts is the largest bookshop in the world. Probably was actually by 1790, which is for the sale of secondhand books and the sale of books that are not new. He was notorious also because of because he refused to take credit. It was for cash only, and that caused ruptions in the trade. There's a lot I could say about that, but I won't. But we do that. It's a very, very important question to remember. We do, through the work on sites, actually, rather than through the catalogues, rather than through ESTC, through the works on actually the places and concentrating on what those premises did, we do actually get more of a sense of circulation than we do by just concentrating on new books. And you can get a sense also of the networks and how books are swapped. And through, interestingly, my work on Charleston, particularly when the Charleston booksellers in North America, the Library Society in Charleston contacted booksellers in London. You get a sense in that book that I wrote about Charleston of the correspondence of how they go to one bookseller and that bookseller rushes around and asks other booksellers for copies of other books. And it's very interesting how in, say, 1750, there's an expectation that a book that's 150 years old can be easily available, when it's obviously not, often not. So this, the history of the searching for the book and of the circulation of older books is really a really important element. And there are a whole range of different sort of sources to get to that. And I'd be really interested to know how that works in Mexico as well, where in terms of looking for the circulation and what I've called the currency of books. So the idea, which, as you say, is very, very important to have an understanding of a change at different times. But the second part of your question is also important, and I don't know whether Lorette, can you put up the picture of my book, of the front book? I'm looking at it, but the front, I think I've got it on screen here, the actual slideshow one, because if you look at that, if you look at the painting there, which is from 1820, you can see that outside the shops down Paternosteros, and I asked it specifically to be put into the digital walk down the street, the sticks either side. Can you see the sticks in front? Now, they were used for advertising. So often at this page, these are really, they've become more like sort of posts to stop traffic going onto the pavement. But the original purpose was that they held advertising boards, and the title pages of the books that had just been published would be stuck on those posts. So when you walked down, you saw the latest title pages stuck on the posts, which were certainly in the early 18th century. I don't think, I might be wrong, but I've never come across in the 18th or the 19th century or 20th century the equivalent of what you're talking about. Did you say it was coyotes?
Coyote, yeah, like coyote, because he.
No, I've just come across no equivalent of that. No one was employed to actually sort of, talk about a latest. It was reliant on on advertising in the shop windows or on these posts, it to that extent was very literate in a way. You know, it was something that you read about or you saw. There's some, you've probably seen them, very interesting late 18th, early 19th century prints, engravings of customers peering at the window, looking at the window to see what the latest title page is. And many more title pages were printed precisely to be an advertising medium. But in terms of an individual employed to shout out or to try to cajole, I think that's the English word, perhaps it's the same thing, to cajole people to buy. No, I don't know of that at all in England anywhere.
Yeah, because I think if you have this your bookstore at the fourth floor, how people are going to buy you. So you need someone downstairs carrying the people to your store. So that's what a coyote does here in Mexico. So thank you very much for your answers.
And it shows how interesting this comparative perspective is, you know, to see what happened in Mexico City, to see what happened in Paris, in Madrid, and other places, and that's the sorts of differences. My hunch here is in London, because it's so old, you're thinking about this traditional sites, and so some of these sites which had the printing press always had to be on the ground floor, and even if you don't have a printing press, still most of the selling is on the ground floor. The salon on the literary place is on the first or second floor above, and so there's no selling. I don't think there's any selling of books above the ground floor. I think the sale is actually on the ground. It's grounded. It's a grounded tradition.
Okay, thank you.
Muy bien. James, do you still have time for one question? I think Pablo had raised his hand. Pablo, adelante.
Hi, thank you, Professor Raven. It was very, very, very interesting, and this research. It's very, very, how do you say that? It gave us a lot of pressure and a lot of ideas to come for our research. And I was wondering about what might be called the habitat of traders, not only book traders. You mentioned the meat market was near. I don't know very well London. I have not visited the city often. So I was wondering about relations between booksellers and other kinds of trade. How are they related, and how does book trade is inserted in the general economy of London? Why this neighborhood and not other? Why and how is it related with other kind of business?
Yeah, that's a fantastic. Thank you, Pedro. That's a fantastic question, and it's really central to what I do. And I suppose, you know, I come to this. I'm a historian. I wasn't a bibliographer. I wasn't a librarian. I was, you know, I've taught myself bibliography, but originally I was a social and cultural historian. And so that's the way it's probably a bit evident. It's my strength and my weakness. It's the way that I think about things. I think about the history of an area generally. And that's where I think you need to have this sort of lateral thinking. Think about what other sort of source, you know, could there be that might shed light on the book trade. And you point to something that's really, I think, really important, just as Manuel was talking about time and the fact that, you know, it's not just new publication and the currency of other publications. You've also got to think about, exactly as you said, habitat, environment, and the relationship between the other trades. So that example between the meat market and the binders is really interesting. If you remember my, excuse me, where I showed the binders, I couldn't remember at the time. It's called in geography conglomeration theory. The idea that if you have a successful trade, other similar trades will come towards it. So if you have one successful binder, suddenly all the binders who normally are peripatetic and move around and don't have a fixed site will actually be attracted to the idea of a fixed site. A binder has their tools and they can move. They can be a person moving around. But this idea of more fixed site trading secures it in relation to other, not just other trades, but other possibilities. The leftovers here of the cows and the cattle, the hides that are available, the leather, the leather and the binding. So, and the relationship, you could point to a relationship between other, for example, glassmakers, engravers, the engravers on silver and glass, and how they transfer the engraving skills into printing skills. And you can see again how in fixed sites that moves around. And you can see again on the Strand, which is interesting, because the Strand becomes more of an area of luxury trade. You have high market, what in the 18th century were called toys, that is fancy goods, consumer goods, fancy buttons, silverware, glassware, luxury books, and so forth, musical instruments. So you've got a relationship, say, between the making of musical instruments and the printing of musical scores, again, within a neighborhood. And the neighborhood of different languages as well, of different importers of different goods from different parts of the world, again, because of a language community around a German Lutheran church, for example, off the Strand, or a French Huguenot or Protestant church, and Huguenot networks of influence and family. That's all part of the habitat and environment, which is to do with social. It's a social history of different peoples, as well as an environment of different trades. And it's such an important part of building up a picture of the broad context of the environment, of the history of all these different activities in the book world. And of course, you've got to remember that many of these individuals were also what we'd now call multitasking, or they had multiple trades. I mean, for example, many of the booksellers also sold medicines. That was a common relationship. They sold medicines and drugs. Some of the stationers, for reasons maybe to do with barrels, that books came in barrels, many of the stationers also brewed beer. So on the same site, you have beer makers and stationers and paper makers. And, so, excuse me, there's a dependency. There's a relationship of dependency and of shared activity as well between these sites, which makes this a really exciting, a very complicated picture, but in a city like London, really, really interesting. But I think also in smaller centres, it's interesting. In regional towns, you can see the same thing in at least in England. You can do this sort of thing on a much smaller scale in individual regional centres too. But, Pablo, that's a really, really interesting question. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, and for this conference, very, very interesting, for answering all our questions. And I think the next step that we should do is translate Bookscape and make a chapter of adaptation to Mexico City. So it can be used for all the people who want to know about that kind of curiosity, and to help to build book history in our region, ¿no? Well, thank a lot. Si no hay más dudas o preguntas, les agradezco muchísimo que hayan estado con nosotros en esta reunión, y bueno, pues si tuvieran más dudas o preguntas, con muchísimo gusto se las puedo transmitir al Dr. Raven. James, if there are more questions, I can send them to you. Is it so? Thanks a lot. And I'm sure we'll see you very soon, because we have many projects in common. So thanks a lot. And it's only the beginning of a very, very great collaboration. And I invite also my colleagues, los invito, si pueden, la próxima reunión de la Bibliographical Society, de la que James es presidente, si quieren asistir. La pasada estuvo nuestra colega Marta Romero, porque fue sobre encuadernación y estuvo realmente espectacular, así que con gusto les transmito las invitaciones en cuanto me lleguen. No hay que ser miembro, aunque si se hacen miembros, evidentemente también es interesante, pero no es necesario para asistir, y son realmente reuniones muy, muy interesantes para nosotros. Muchísimas gracias. Thanks a lot, James.
Bye-bye.
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 Bye, thank you.
Nos vemos muy pronto, y mañana, acuérdense, diálogo de joyas, así que los que quieran están invitadísimos. Muchas gracias.
Bye bye, nos vemos.
Bye bye.